CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The World Today, live from CGTN in London. I'm Polly Middlehurst. Our top story today. A small family funeral with the world watching. Prince Philip is laid to rest in the chapel at Windsor Castle. Also in the news today, another grim coronavirus milestone as the global death toll surpasses 3 million people. Protesters in Yangon welcome the new national unity government set up to oppose the country's military rulers. And it's the end of an era for Cubans. Raul Castro hands over the leadership of the Communist Party to a brand new generation. Our main story today, Prince Philip's kindness, humour and humanity has been celebrated at a ceremonial royal funeral at Windsor Castle. The Duke of Edinburgh's unwavering loyalty to the Queen was also recognised as family members gathered to pay their last respects. Her Majesty the Queen, the Duke's 4 children and 8 grandchildren were among the 30 mourners allowed to attend the service, with COVID-19 restrictions preventing a larger turnout. Prince Philip passed away last Friday, just 2 months before his 100th birthday. Let's take you live now to Windsor. Our correspondent Paul Barber is there. And Paul, talk us through what happened today.
Well, Polly, it's been an absolutely glorious sunny day here in Windsor to the west of London. The service itself was certainly austere and simple, certainly by the standards of British royal funerals, but it was incredibly moving for the fact that there were so few people there, just 30 people in the congregation. As you said, this service had Prince Philip's stamp all over it. Certainly very simple, no eulogy, no sermon, just that beautiful choral music. We heard some of that in the headlines just now, and some trumpet fanfare. A strong nod to the Royal Navy. Prince Philip was an officer in World War II, and a naval wartime hero before he married the then Princess Elizabeth. The whole day really had Prince Philip's stamp on it. It was meticulously timed to the very second. Before that procession to St George's Chapel in Windsor, his coffin was laid on the back of a specially modified Land Rover truck that the Prince had played a hand in designing himself. Members of the family then followed that Land Rover to St George's Chapel. The Queen herself in the Royal Bentley with just her lady-in-waiting. A minute's silence was held around the UK, and then the service got underway. The Queen herself sitting separately from her family, wearing a mask, as were all members of the royal family. Just 30 members there. 800 people had to attend this funeral. Of course, this is the time of COVID, and that also meant well-wishers from around the UK were discouraged from coming to Windsor to pay their respects. They were asked to stay home watching the televised coverage. There's been a very heavy police presence here in Windsor, with wardens and police officers making sure that people don't congregate. It's been pretty quiet, to be honest, walking around the town. I mean, the comparison to
service to the nation and the Commonwealth.
It's stark.
Paul Barber there for us in Windsor, and apologies for some interruptions on sound there. Well, joining us now for more on that from Cambridge is Professor Anna Whitelock, who's a royal historian. Thank you for joining us, Professor. A ceremonial procession, a family funeral service, but not a state funeral.
No, not a state funeral, in chime with the Prince's own wishes. He did not want a state funeral. He didn't want a great deal of fuss. He wanted very much for everybody to get on with it, and he wanted a simple but significant service. And of course, because of COVID, it was pared back even more, which somehow made it more poignant. A beautiful service with pieces of music, reading selected by the Duke, very much speaking to his naval interests, his great love of theology, of service and of duty. And of course, watching all of it on her own at the front was the Queen, a very dignified but very diminished figure, and there's no doubt that she really did capture, I think, everybody's heart by her there alone, obviously racked with grief.
Some very poignant images of the Queen indeed, 94 years old, having lost her husband, seated alone. One would imagine not just viewers in the United Kingdom, but those globally watching around the world also having perhaps during the coronavirus pandemic have lost members of their own families, really feeling like the royal family is no exception when it comes to death.
Absolutely. I mean, this was a royal family funeral, but it was a family funeral, and like so many, this was broadcast, if not on Zoom, but certainly around the world, with everybody watching and family united in grief, but of course at social distant lengths, separate from one another. And the Queen was there alone, and yes, she celebrates her 95th birthday in the coming days, and watched as her partner of 73 years was laid to rest. I mean, incredibly powerful, and she may be Queen, but at this moment she is a widow, struggling to come to terms with the loss of her life partner.
The funeral itself now, Professor, is concluded. But what happens next? What happens to the Duke's coffin? Is he to be buried in St George's?
So the Duke's coffin was lowered by a mechanical lift into the royal vault beneath the chapel. The last time it was opened for a coffin was at the funeral of the Queen's father, George VI, right back in 1952, and obviously the Queen watched at that point too. Philip's coffin will rest in the royal vault in the chapel there, and then on the Queen's passing, the two will be united and moved to the George VI Memorial Chapel, where they will both be laid to rest with the Queen's father and the Queen's mother. And so he now waits for her, and the Queen moves into what is clearly the twilight of this very long Elizabethan reign. But strikingly now, she is a queen alone. She is a widowed queen.
Professor Anna Whitelock, thank you very much indeed, and full details of that funeral that took place today in Windsor on our website, cgtn.com. Well, in other news today, global coronavirus deaths have now surpassed 3 million. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And a third of those lives that were lost in Europe. And as cases continue to rise, Germany's federal government is now debating whether or not to take full control of COVID-19 response measures from the country's individual states. Natalie Carney has this report now from Munich.
Germany has been battling stubbornly high coronavirus infection numbers while struggling to get the population vaccinated quickly enough. As a federation, Germany's 16 states have largely had the say on how they deal with the pandemic, meaning some states have been easing lockdowns while others have been tightening them. Now Berlin wants to take more control. The German chancellor is urging lawmakers to change the Infection Protection Act to allow her to force coronavirus lockdowns and curfews on areas with high infection rates, a decision currently left to local authorities.
Doctors and nurses need our support, the support of all of us. That is why we have to do everything to stop, break and reverse the third wave. And that's why we need to create a new basis for the federal and states' fight against the pandemic with an addition to the Infection Protection Act. Every day counts. Each day we can apply the emergency brake earlier is a day one. I ask for your support so that this important law can help very soon to break the third wave.
These new powers would need the approval of the lower house of parliament, which Angela Merkel addressed on Friday, but also the state-run upper house, which is likely to be reluctant to ceding any authority over healthcare issues to the federal government.
A decision is expected to be made on Wednesday. Meanwhile, other European countries have announced an easing of restrictions. From Monday, high schools, universities, cinemas, shopping malls and indoor areas of restaurants in Portugal will reopen in the majority of the country, while Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi has said his country will begin relaxing measures starting April 26th.
Nel senso che si dà precedenza alle attività all'aperto.
We will give priority to outdoor activities. For example, restaurants will be able to open at lunch and dinner with outdoor tables. We are also going to give priority to the schools reopening. All schools of every grade will completely reopen with the presence of students in the yellow and orange zones.
France is considering declaring a day of national tribute to the victims of the pandemic as the COVID-19 death toll there passes 100,000.
In all the Parisian cemeteries in 2019, we conducted 9,500 burials. Burials of coffins, burials of ashes, or ashes dispersal. In 2020, the figure was 12,500, so an increase in activity of close to 30%.
And on Friday, Austria commemorated its COVID-19 victims in a ceremony led by Chancellor Sebastian Kurz and other government members. Natalie Carney, CGTN in Munich.
Myanmar's military leader will attend the ASEAN summit next weekend, his first foreign trip since the takeover in February. The military also released more than 23,000 prisoners under a New Year amnesty. The move comes as violent protests continued across the country. DRAGHI has more now from Yangon.
Myanmar's military leader Min Aung Hlaing says he will take part in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Special Summit in Jakarta next week. It will be his first official foreign trip since the military takeover on February the 1st. Since last month, regional leaders have sought to open communications with Myanmar State Administration Council. Indonesia President Joko Widodo called for a special summit to discuss the worsening situation in Myanmar. And ASEAN Chair Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah of Brunei agreed on Wednesday to invite all ASEAN leaders for a face-to-face meeting in Jakarta on April the 24th. Opponents of Myanmar's military announced the National Unity Government on Friday, including ousted members of the parliament and the leaders of anti-military protests and ethnic minorities. National Unity Government spokesman Dr. Sa has urged ASEAN to reject Min Aung Hlaing's participation in the meeting. Says ASEAN would be hurting its credibility by giving Min Aung Hlaing a seat at the table. Meanwhile, the president's office has announced the plans to release more than 23,000 prisoners nationwide on Saturday to mark the country's new year. 23,047 Myanmar prisoners and 137 foreign inmates will be released on humanitarian grounds. The country's biggest city, Yangon, was largely peaceful on Saturday, with some residents holding signs welcoming the newly formed National Unity Government. Some people in Mandalay region took to the streets to protest against the military and welcomed the interim government. And at least 2 civilians were killed in a military crackdown on protesters in Mogul City, north of Mandalay. Footage released on social media show police take away a victim's body. Gao Jiayi for CGTN in Yangon.
Still ahead on the world today, the struggle is real. Balancing work and childcare can be difficult for many families, but one Chinese entrepreneur says you can have both.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination programme offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
Welcome back. Here with CGTN in London. Our top stories. A small family funeral with the world watching. The UK's Prince Philip is laid to rest in the chapel at Windsor Castle. And another grim coronavirus milestone as the global death toll surpasses 3 million people. So Brazil then has the world's second highest number of COVID deaths. Around 3,000 people are dying every day. Doctors, nurses and medical staff are amongst those victims as well. And last year, about 1,200 lost their lives. That's one death every 7.5 hours. Well, now experts are worried the country's healthcare system is collapsing. Lucretia Franco reports now from Rio.
An intensive care unit in Rio de Janeiro, the front line of Brazil's battle against COVID-19. Patients receiving vital medication and precious oxygen, intubated and struggling. Units like this one are some of the most dangerous places in the world, and these healthcare workers are exhausted. 37-year-old Otávio Chagas is the head of the coronavirus unit at the São João de Meriti hospital. He has been working 120 hours a week for over a year now. He's worried Brazil's massive second wave, thought to be linked to the highly infectious P1 coronavirus variant, has now started to affect younger people.
What we are seeing is extremely sad. People aged 35, 40 and 50 are becoming seriously ill or dying because of the disease.
When asked if he thought about taking some time off, Otávio's answer was blunt.
If we or anybody else on the medical staff abandon their on-duty shifts, who is going to do our work?
The majority of hospitals across Brazil are near the breaking point. Medical supplies are running low, ICUs are at full capacity, and some patients can't get beds. Suffering from an almost total healthcare collapse, Brazil is now running out of doctors, nurses, and support staff. Why? Because so many have already died. Altair Soares, the hospital's director, says oxygen, medicine, and antibiotics are periodically running out. But it's the death toll of health workers that has him most alarmed.
So many health professionals have died from this disease in Brazil. The cost has been and remains tremendous for these workers who are living this pandemic day in and day out and seeing its effects firsthand.
24-year-old Vanessa Carvalho, a nurse technician, decided she had to cut her 60-hour week in half. She was mentally exhausted, but determined to keep working as much as she could.
It's love that brings us to work. For me, it's not about the money. We are in the middle of a pandemic. If it were about the money, I would stay at home. We are here because we really love what we do.
In return, she says she would like people to take the pandemic more seriously and follow recommended safety measures. She says that, too, can save lives. Lucrecia Franco, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
Cuba's Castro is coming to an end 10 years after succeeding his brother Fidel. Raul Castro has announced now he's resigning as head of the country's Communist Party. And whoever takes over faces numerous challenges in the country, not least a battered economy and growing inequality. Luis Chirino has the latest now from Havana.
The Cuban Communist top gathering opened sessions in Havana, presided over by the General Secretary of the political organization, Raúl Castro, who is expected to hand over his post to a new leader to be elected by the Congress. The changing of the guard marks the first time in more than 60 years that Cuba will not have a leader named Castro.
I conclude my task as first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, satisfied with having met my duties and confident in the future of our homeland.
During the Congress's opening session, also attended by President Miguel Díaz-Canel, Raúl Castro reiterated Cuba's position towards normalizing relations with the United States.
Ratifico desde este Congreso del Partido.
I ratify our willingness to hold a respectful dialogue and build a new kind of relation with the United States without any pretensions that Cuba should renounce the principles of its revolution and socialism.
The four-day meeting includes debates over the future of the party, with some on the island calling for radical change and financial reforms. The 8th Congress is expected to be a starting point for new generations to keep boosting crucial social and economic transformations started by the revolution's historic generations to advance the socialist project declared by Cuban revolution leader Fidel Castro on April 16, 1961. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
China has resolutely opposed a joint statement made by the United States and Japan, saying their actions are stoking division. The Chinese embassy in the United States says comments made by President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga went far beyond the scope of normal development of bilateral relations. Biden and Suga addressed a range of geopolitical issues, but China was top of the agenda.
We committed to working together to take on the challenges from China and on issues like the East China Sea, the South China Sea, as well as North Korea, to ensure a future of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
We agreed on the necessity for each of us to engage in frank dialogue with China and, in so doing, to pursue stability of international relations while upholding universal values.
Let's take a look now at some other news from around the world. The US climate envoy John Kerry has arrived in Seoul following a 4-day trip to China. Greeted by the country's foreign minister, the visit comes ahead of next week's virtual summit of world leaders called by President Biden to discuss the climate crisis. Iran has named a suspect in connection with a recent explosion at the Natanz nuclear facility. State TV saying the 43-year-old fled the country before last Sunday's blast, which Tehran has blamed on Israel. The country is claiming the centrifuges damaged in the blast have now been replaced. And chanting Black Lives Matter and holding signs calling for justice for DAUNTE WRIGHT, hundreds of demonstrators again gathered outside a Brooklyn Center police station on Friday, protesting against the shooting of the 20-year-old black man by a white police officer. Around 100 arrests were made on the 6th night of unrest in the city. And 3 members of the Expedition 64 team have returned safely to Earth after spending 6 months on the International Space Station. A Russian Soyuz spacecraft carrying a NASA astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts touched down in Kazakhstan. The team ended a 185-day mission spanning 2,960 orbits of planet Earth. Now, many women around the world face a challenge to balance their careers and their personal lives, especially those with childcare needs. One woman entrepreneur, though, in China is now saying that shouldn't be the case. So she started a factory, and her one requirement for recruits, you better be a mother. CGTN's Sun Ye has the story.
Like other clothing workshops, Xiang Jingyan's factory in the outskirts of Wuhan turns out the usual school uniforms with usual designs, sold at usual price margins. But Xiang's factory is now known nationwide for her one unusual hiring requirement. She only employs mothers who need to take care of their children.
I had the same challenge when I gave birth to my second child. I had to stay at home for quite some time. I couldn't find a job to accommodate my needs. I will always remember the time when I saw a man screaming at his wife after she asked for some money to buy a little gadget. I couldn't stand that her work at home was not appreciated.
A recent national survey says almost 30% of women had trouble looking for jobs because of their gender or the family obligations or child-rearing responsibilities that almost always fall on them.
In Xiang's factory, the timetable is flexible. A worker can clock in early or late or even stay at home to work, depending on her family obligations. There are no night shifts, for evenings are reserved for the family.
I had only one requirement when I set out to find a job after my daughter was born, that I have time to take care of her. It took me 4 years to find this job.
Xiang says the arrangement costs a little more, but an all-women workforce has yielded benefits.
Our team is incredibly stable. There are no resignations on short notice ever. And I've had calls since the news spread. People ask me, hey, can you set up a factory like yours in my place? And we've got more orders this year.
Some mothers in the factory tell us working at Jia Shifen is inspiring.
I started out here not knowing a thing about clothing. I made a pact with my daughter then. The two of us will each work hard and do our best. Now I'm a veteran here, and my daughter finished #1 in the whole grade last semester.
Xiang says she has plans to expand and hire more mothers. She has also put up her motto in the warehouse. It reads, "Independence is the best thing one can have." 孙野 CGTN 武汉。
A reminder of our top story today. Small family funeral, but with the world watching, the UK's Prince Philip has been laid to rest in the chapel at Windsor Castle. In a moment, Stephen Cole is here with the agenda, and on this week's show, charging ahead. Is the world really ready to turn its back on the internal combustion engine in favour of electric cars? That's the agenda with Stephen Cole, right after The World Today at 16:30 here on CGTN. Well, that's just about it from The World Today. Thanks very much for watching. We're available on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can always find us as well on YouTube and Dailymotion, and of course, as ever, at cgtn.com and on the CGTN app. From all of us here on the team in London, very goodbye to you. The agenda is next.